The day I jokingly told a woman, "I'd marry you if I were younger," I expected a laugh, a polite smile, maybe a playful reply. Instead, she looked at me with quiet eyes that carried years of invisible battles and whispered something that made every excuse I'd ever hidden behind crumble in an instant. In that single moment, surrounded by sunlight and the ordinary sounds of a busy afternoon, I realized I had completely misunderstood what love, loneliness, and courage truly meant. Before we begin this unforgettable journey, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel. Every act of support helps our community continue sharing stories that remind us all how powerful compassion can be. The town of Ashford was the kind of place where people recognized each other without always knowing each other's stories. The sidewalks were lined with old maple trees that cast wide patches of shade over benches where retirees gathered to watch the world pass by. Every Saturday afternoon the local farmers' market filled the square with flowers, fresh bread, homemade jams, and musicians who played cheerful songs while children chased bubbles floating through the warm air. It was impossible to walk through that market without smiling, even if life had given you every reason not to. Graham Holloway had visited that market nearly every weekend since retiring from his career as a high school history teacher. At 74, he carried himself with gentle dignity, though age had slowly bent his shoulders and silvered every strand of his hair. After losing his wife, Margaret, 6 years earlier to cancer, Graham had settled into a routine that looked peaceful from the outside but felt painfully empty within. Friends often invited him to social gatherings, but he politely declined more often than not. He convinced himself he wasn't lonely because loneliness was easier to ignore than grief. His favorite stop was a tiny flower stand run by a woman named Celeste Rowan. She was 53, energetic without trying to appear young, and possessed the kind of smile that made strangers feel remembered. Every bouquet she arranged looked like it had been gathered with affection instead of simply tied together for sale. She greeted every customer by name whenever she could, and when she couldn't remember, she asked again with genuine interest instead of pretending. Graham first noticed her because she laughed with her entire face. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was honest. That laugh seemed untouched by bitterness, though he often wondered how anyone could reach middle age without carrying invisible scars. Week after week they exchanged small conversations. They discussed weather, books, gardening, favorite recipes, and the changing seasons. Graham found himself arriving earlier each Saturday, inventing reasons to buy flowers despite having no one waiting at home to receive them. He placed every bouquet beside Margaret's framed photograph, quietly thanking her for teaching him to appreciate beauty even after loss. Celeste noticed the flowers disappeared every week and eventually asked if he owned the happiest dining room in town. He admitted they were for his late wife. Instead of offering awkward sympathy, she simply nodded with understanding. That quiet respect made him trust her more than elaborate words ever could. As months passed, they became friends. Graham learned Celeste had spent nearly 20 years caring for her husband after a devastating workplace accident left him disabled. She had worked multiple jobs, raised 2 children, managed endless hospital visits, and somehow never lost her kindness. Her husband had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving her exhausted but grateful for every difficult year they had shared. Neither of them called it friendship at first. It simply became the brightest part of their Saturdays. One warm spring afternoon they sat together on a bench after the market closed, eating slices of homemade apple pie sold by a nearby bakery. The square buzzed with families carrying bags of vegetables while dogs tugged happily on their leashes. It was one of those afternoons that felt too beautiful to hurry through. Celeste laughed after Graham made a terrible joke about retirement being nature's way of forcing people to organize their garages. Watching her smile, something escaped his mouth before he could stop it. He chuckled and casually remarked that he'd marry her if he were younger. The words were meant as harmless flattery. A compliment. Nothing more. Her smile faded only slightly. She looked toward the fountain where sunlight shimmered across the water. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. She said age wasn't the reason he wouldn't marry her. Fear was. Those few words landed harder than any insult ever could. She gently explained that people often blamed age, timing, distance, or circumstance when what truly frightened them was risking another broken heart. Growing older hadn't made people incapable of love. It had only made rejection feel more expensive. Graham couldn't answer. Because somewhere deep inside, he knew she wasn't talking only about him. She was talking about herself too. The conversation changed something neither of them could undo. For the first time since Margaret's death, Graham admitted to himself that he had been surviving instead of living. He had hidden behind memories because memories couldn't disappoint him. They couldn't leave again. Over the following weeks he found himself thinking constantly about Celeste's words. Fear. Not age. Fear. He replayed every opportunity he'd avoided. Every invitation declined. Every friendship kept comfortably distant. He had mistaken emotional safety for healing. Meanwhile, Celeste continued running her flower stand exactly as before, never mentioning the conversation again. She remained warm but careful, allowing Graham all the space he needed without withdrawing her friendship. That quiet patience somehow made him admire her even more. One afternoon Graham visited the community library where he had volunteered for years. While organizing donated books, he overheard two teenagers laughing at an elderly couple holding hands outside. One boy joked that romance should have an expiration date. The librarian smiled sadly and whispered that people who had never experienced real loneliness often underestimated the value of companionship. Those words echoed beside Celeste's. Fear. Companionship. Second chances. Graham began noticing elderly couples everywhere. Some walked slowly with canes. Others argued affectionately over grocery lists. None appeared embarrassed by loving each other. Only he seemed trapped inside invisible rules he had written for himself. Several weeks later the town organized its annual garden festival. Celeste spent days preparing elaborate floral displays while volunteers transformed the park into a celebration of color. Graham signed up to help. Not because he loved gardening. Because he wanted another excuse to spend time beside her. They arranged flowers together beneath brilliant sunshine, laughing whenever Graham accidentally placed blossoms in the wrong containers. Working side by side felt unexpectedly natural. People assumed they'd known each other forever. Perhaps, emotionally, they already had. During lunch a little girl approached their table carrying a wilted daisy. She explained she'd accidentally stepped on it. Celeste carefully trimmed the stem, placed it into fresh water, and added several tiny wildflowers around it until the bouquet looked beautiful again. The little girl's face lit with wonder. After she skipped away, Graham quietly remarked that Celeste had rescued a flower everyone else would have thrown away. She smiled gently and answered that damaged things often needed care, not replacement. Again, Graham felt as though she wasn't talking only about flowers. The festival ended with awards for the best displays. Celeste won first place. When the announcer asked how she created arrangements that touched people's hearts, she answered that every flower deserved to belong somewhere. Graham applauded harder than anyone. Days later he invited her for lunch at a small cafe overlooking the river. For the first time, neither pretended it was simply convenience. They talked for hours. About regrets. Children who now lived in different states. Dreams they'd postponed. Books they still hoped to read. Places they'd never visited. They laughed. They cried. They admitted how exhausting loneliness could become when disguised as independence. Graham confessed he'd felt guilty whenever happiness appeared after Margaret's death. Celeste gently reminded him that lasting love doesn't demand permanent sadness. It teaches gratitude. She explained she still loved her late husband deeply. Nothing about caring for someone new erased what came before. He realized grief and hope were never enemies. They could exist together. Summer slowly painted the town in brighter colors. Neighbors noticed Graham smiling more often. He attended community concerts. He joined volunteer projects. He laughed freely. The man who once hurried home after buying flowers now lingered wherever people gathered. Not because loneliness had disappeared. Because connection had returned. Then life tested both of them. Celeste's flower business struggled after severe storms damaged several local farms. Supply costs soared. She quietly considered closing the stand she'd spent years building. Rather than watching silently, Graham organized a community fundraiser. Former students, neighbors, librarians, teachers, firefighters, nurses, and local business owners all contributed. Some donated money. Others volunteered labor. Children painted signs encouraging people to support the flower shop that had brightened countless celebrations and comforted countless funerals. The response overwhelmed Celeste. She had spent years helping everyone else without expecting anything in return. Now the entire town reminded her that kindness always leaves footprints. Watching hundreds of people gather around her stand, she cried openly for the first time since her husband's funeral. Graham stood quietly beside her. Not trying to fix her tears. Simply refusing to let her face them alone. Months later, on another sunny Saturday afternoon, they returned to the same bench where everything had changed. The fountain sparkled exactly as before. Children still chased bubbles. Musicians still filled the square with cheerful melodies. Life looked almost identical. Yet both of them had become entirely different people. Graham smiled nervously. He admitted he'd been thinking about something for a very long time. He confessed that his joke months earlier had hidden a truth he had been too frightened to admit. Age had never been the obstacle. Fear had been. And fear no longer deserved to make his decisions. He reached for her hand with trembling fingers. There was no audience. No dramatic music. No expensive ring. Only two people who had survived heartbreak choosing courage anyway. Celeste squeezed his hand before he could finish speaking. She smiled through grateful tears because she already knew what he was trying to say. Love had arrived quietly. Without rushing. Without replacing the past. Without demanding perfection. It simply asked them to stop running from tomorrow. They never tried to become the young couple they once might have been. Instead, they became something stronger. Two people who understood that love isn't measured by how early it begins but by how honestly it is lived. They traveled together during the daytime, visited botanical gardens, volunteered at schools, planted flowers in neglected parks, and spent weekends reading on shaded benches where strangers often assumed they'd been together forever. Whenever someone complimented their relationship, Graham laughed and admitted that the wisest lesson of his life came from a woman selling flowers who refused to let him hide behind excuses. Before we reach the end of this story, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe is the greatest obstacle to love, fear, pride, regret, or something else, and share a lesson you've learned about giving yourself or someone else a second chance. Years later, Graham often reflected on that unforgettable afternoon when he casually joked that he would have married Celeste if he were younger. He smiled every time he remembered her unforgettable reply because she hadn't simply answered his joke. She had rescued his future. Sometimes the most life-changing words are not spoken with great drama. They arrive softly, honestly, and at exactly the moment a heart is finally ready to hear them. Graham discovered that growing older doesn't close the door to love. Fear does. And the moment we choose courage over fear, hope quietly walks back into our lives carrying flowers we never expected to receive. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Thank you for being part of our community, where every story reminds us that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life when we least expect it.